Hello, AP and CCP U.S. history students. Mr. V coming to you today to talk to you about Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson and the Age of Jackson, as it's known, starts theoretically back in 1824 when he loses, quote unquote, the election to John Quincy Adams. Again, that was the corrupt bargain. That was the idea that somehow and in some way, in an underhanded fashion, Henry Clay, as the Speaker of the House, swayed the House of Representatives to vote in John Quincy Adams, who had lost the popular vote and was still behind in the Electoral College in 1824, but swayed it to John Quincy Adams. And then John Quincy Adams, when he took over as president, allowed for Henry Clay to become Secretary of State, which was considered as in the early American Republic, the stepping stone to the American presidency. Now, as we discussed in previous presentations here, we've discussed that there's really nothing corrupt about it. It's totally legal. They can actually do that if they wanted to. And then you can also count in the fact that Henry Clay was probably the odds-on choice to be Secretary of State in general. Be that as it may, in the end, John Quincy Adams takes over. Now, he has a very uneventful presidency. He's in there for only the 4 years. There is a rise in nationalism during his time, but it's really not all that concerning. If anything, he's dealing with the fallout of Monroe's presidency, whether it be the Missouri Compromise, whether it be the issues of foreign powers and the Monroe Doctrine. In the end, in the election of 1828, it becomes very clear that the populist edge is going to go to Andrew Jackson. So John Quincy Adams, just like his father, is going to be a one-term president. Now, of course, during this campaign, the campaign presentation is a little different because the Jacksonians realize that they can garner public support by throwing what is known as a convention. And for the first time, they hold a party convention. The Democrats are the first ones to really come up with the concept of getting all these party leaders together to kind of rally around the candidate. So by doing so, they pretty much set the stage for a splintering of the group that remained after the fallout of the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Now you're going to have the Jacksonian Democrats, and you're going to have a group that's basically called the National Republicans. Now, the National Republicans are going to fizzle after a while because they really don't have any leadership, and that's going to, from the ashes, produce the Whig Party. But that's another story down the road. In the campaign, however, there is mudslinging. And mudslinging is the idea that you're going to dredge up all these dirty little secrets and dirty little, scandals or whatever else about the other person, and you're going to try and paint them as being horrible human beings. So, for example, in 2020, when, Joe Biden would level things about Donald Trump's personal life or would level things about Donald Trump as president and talk about some of the, he's got Russian collusion or he's made illegal deals with other foreign leaders or he's made money off of the presidency. And then Trump would kind of level back at him that his son was doing some underhanded things. He, at one point during one of the debates, called his son a drug addict. So again, it's kind of dredging up these ugly little things about each candidate and throwing it. That is considered mudslinging. Well, it was no different in 1828. Andrew Jackson leveled all kinds of charges against John Quincy Adams about his personal life. He literally called him a pimp for the Russian czar, because back when John Quincy Adams was a diplomat in Russia, he was very good friends with the czar Alexander I. And by being friends with Tsar Alexander, there were kind of rumors that he had kind of got women for Alexander I. Now, of course, this ended up being completely fabricated and was a story that was picked up by less than reputable news services, but it gained traction. And he had some other things that were leveled against him too. And it's not like John Quincy Adams was completely, innocent in all this too, because he was allowing for people to level all kinds of charges against Jackson. Now, some of them had a shred of truth. They went after him for being a murderer, and as we've discussed, Jackson did kill people in duels, and he had also killed some soldiers during his service as a general. He also had a very checkered history with Native Americans. So Jackson does kind of have this aura about him that not only is he a war hero, but he's done some questionable things as well when it comes to violence. He's got a hot temper, that's true, but they also level all kinds of charges about how he basically loses his temper and starts violent outbursts against everyone and everything. Of course, the most major one is are the rumors about his wife. These are the things that Jackson does not do okay with. You don't make fun of his wife. You don't say nasty things, but they did anyway. So Jackson really at that point is kind of having to weather the storm. He purposely cancels all subscriptions to every magazine and newspaper that would go to his house at the Hermitage in Nashville because he doesn't want his wife Rachel to see any negative press about her or their marriage. Because if you remember, we talked about this before. Jackson married Rachel when Rachel was not really divorced from her first husband. Her husband had not filed the paperwork properly. So when they got married, they were not technically divorced. So if you marry somebody that isn't technically divorced, you are, in technical jargon, you are an adulterer. You are committing adultery. Now, Jackson, of course, would have never married her if he realized that, hey, she's still married. They would have waited. But, in a glitch of paperwork back in the 1800s, that's what happened. And he had been kind of putting up with those rumors all throughout his political career and even when he was serving in the military. But that is leveled and kind of brought out of the mothballs here in 1828. And so, not surprisingly, it becomes a problem. So, sure enough, in the election, the events are that Jackson wins in pretty much a landslide. Okay. And if you look at the Electoral College map, this isn't even really close. Jackson in the yellow here wins predominantly the middle America, if you will, and it's an overwhelming amount. You can see electorally in the Electoral College, he wins 68% of the vote, 178 votes to John Quincy Adams, only 83, and he was really only winning the coastal Federalist territories, the hardcore Federalist areas that no longer are Federalist because the Federalists had died out. So the remnants of the Federalist Party were voting for Adams, but the vast majority of the populist Democrats were voting for Jackson. So Jackson is going to ride into the White House with a fairly large mandate. And we talked about mandates the other day as being the power of the president coming into the office. So Jackson is really riding high when he comes into office. Now, who is he? Again, he's a war hero. We've talked about him before. He's not only a war hero from the War of 1812, because of his defense of New Orleans. He's also a war hero because of his treatment of Native Americans, specifically the Seminoles and what are known as the five civilized tribes that basically are around Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and into Florida. So he had garnered all kinds of international acclaim and, of course, a lot of heroic stature here at home. He had also served in the Senate for a while from Tennessee. And bottom line is he's a household name. I mean, he's somebody that people know. He almost won in 1824, so it wasn't a surprise in 1828 when he ran and won in a large amount. Now, Jackson has some issues coming into the White House. He may have a mandate from the masses and he may have a lot of power coming into the office, but he's got a lot of sadness while coming into the office because while he tried to keep all of the news reports from his wife, she eventually did see a number of articles basically painting her as a whore. Saying horrible things about her. She ends up having a stroke and she hangs on for a little while, but ends up dying before he ever goes to Washington, D.C. So she knows that Jackson is going to be president. She actually got the stroke while she was shopping for her inaugural ball gown. She was actually going out to find a dress for that event to become first lady, has a stroke and dies because of basically shame and an overwhelming depression from this. Jackson never forgives John Quincy Adams or any of his followers for that kind of mudslinging because he really does care about Rachel more than anything. If you ever go to the Hermitage, you will notice that in the backyard where Jackson and his wife are buried, Jackson is buried next to his wife. His wife is buried under a cupola, like this really nice gazebo, if you will. Her grave is completely pristine. They clean it. They take care of the grounds around it. And that is from Jackson's will. Jackson makes it very clear that for the rest of time, her grave will be taken care of. Meanwhile, his grave right next to it is out in the open. There's no, ceiling over it. There's no special care taken to it because he doesn't care what happens to his grave. He is very serious that her grave will be pristine because he adores her. So say what you want about Andrew Jackson. The guy is a family man, and he does end up taking his daughter and son-in-law and his new grandson with him to the White House. His daughter basically becomes the first lady. Because he doesn't have one, basically. And they live with him at the White House. And by all accounts, he's, like I said, a very good family man. There are stories about how in the middle of the night when his grandson is up and crying and, whatever else, that he would actually walk out every now and then and tell his daughter to go back to bed, go relax, I'll take care of it. So the president's actually walking the baby around, kind of swaddling it and rocking it back and forth, trying to get him back to sleep. That's not something that you would normally expect from a president, but that's kind of how Jackson is. He's very rough. He's very frontiers like, but at the same time, he seems like he's a pretty decent guy to his family and friends. Now, Jackson coming into the office has a number of firsts. Again, he's the first one to ever get nominated officially at a convention. He's the first one that is considered a Western candidate because he's from Tennessee. He is the first one to not have direct ties to the American Revolution. Keep in mind, the first 5 presidents were, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. They all have direct ties to either the Revolution or to the Constitution. John Quincy Adams technically has ties because of his father and because of his diplomatic service. Jackson has none of those ties. So he is, again, kind of a first, and he's the second general to take over the presidency. Obviously, Washington was the first. Washington, while he didn't have formalized school and he didn't have a college degree, still was, pretty well read, pretty well versed in Greek and Roman history and, literature. Jackson is not. Jackson has a very rudimentary education. Nobody else before him did. So you're talking about a guy that is very much different from the previous 6. So the 7th president is the outlier, somebody that really doesn't make sense and mesh with the previous presidents. And Jackson actually takes that as a sign that he's, a pretty good dude because of that. Okay. Now, when he comes into office, it's called the Rule of King Mob. And this painting is pretty famous about it because he invites basically every follower of his, anybody that was, a big supporter of him, to come to the White House, to come to D.C. to watch the inaugural. So massive amounts of people all descend upon the Capitol. And of course, this is no different than any other inauguration when it comes to people showing up. But this is an overwhelming outpouring from people that don't normally get involved in politics. These are people that don't have formal educations. They're not involved in government. They really don't have any experience in the machines of the United States and how the country is run economically, politically, or even socially. These are kind of like the rough and tumble folks are showing up too. These are frontiersmen who are making the trip into DC because one of their guys is making it to the White House. So there are all kinds of stories of raucous behavior, people getting drunk, people misbehaving. There are people that go into the White House and steal things. There are people that when they're in the White House, like, use the drapes to wipe off their boots. They're just really country bumpkin hicks who all descend upon Washington, D.C. and disrupt the flow of everything. So that's why you get this terminology of the Rule of King Mob. Jackson even has to escape the White House at one point. He actually kind of ducks out one of the windows of all places because he's kind of nervous about how this is going. He thinks this is getting out of control, and he kind of goes down the street to stay the night because he realizes that his mansion is being ransacked by his followers. Okay, to put it into modern day perspective, if you remember, like all the Trump caravans that were driving around I-275 prior to the election, just imagine if that caravan were to descend upon DC and just start parking all around the White House, and like everybody gets out, and they've all brought 12 packs of beer, and they're just going to hang out, and they're going to climb on the fences of the White House and kind of scale the fence and go in and just like camp out on the front lawn of the White House. That would be very similar to what this was back then. Just kind of a kind of taking of the America's house, as it were, by the masses. So in the end, in reality, you would categorize that as a kind of anarchist situation, if you will. But bottom line is, Jackson is taking over, and he is different, and he's setting the tone from the very beginning. Now, one of the things that gets very controversial about him is when he comes in, he realizes that he needs to thank the people that helped him get to the office. Remember, he fell short in 1824. By winning in 1828, he feels like he's got to reach out and actually help the people that helped him. And this is kind of the party system, the modern day political parties. So if you get a question on the AP exam that asks when political parties form, one of the strong arguments for this time period would be the fact that the spoils system was developed as a machine where Jackson gets the presidency and then thanks his supporters by giving them government jobs. This is the first time where you really see that. And what's ironic is, by Jackson giving out these government jobs to people, he's doing exactly what he claimed Clay was doing that was illegal. You know, Clay helps John Quincy Adams gets to the presidency in 1824, gets the Secretary of State role, and Jackson cries foul. But in 1828, Jackson's doing basically the same thing. Now, Jackson's supporters and Jackson himself would say, well, that's different. I didn't need help to get to the presidency per se. I just needed support. And there's a difference between handing out a government job to somebody that kind of like skewed the votes to make sure you got in, or giving a government position to somebody who just helped you get there. So Jackson, again, would never admit that that's the same thing. And on its surface, it's really not. But the spoils system, the idea is that you're going to give these government jobs out to people in kind of gratitude for what they helped you do. Now, of course, there are advantages. It's a change over at the new generation. They're younger people typically, so you're getting new ideas. You're getting people that don't normally participate in government. So maybe they're bringing in issues that aren't talked about very often. You get new leaders that were common men. So instead of getting a bunch of Harvard and Yale educated people, you're getting people that are frontiersmen, Southerners. You know, you're getting kind of a more diverse multitude in DC to match maybe the diverse population of the country. And then, of course, it strengthens the party system, because if I am elected and I help you to get a job, then if I'm a Democrat and I help another Democrat get a job, that person is always going to be faithful to the Democratic Party. Now, the disadvantage, of course, you might get some people that are incompetent. You might get some people that were only given a government job in order to say thank you. And maybe they're not very good at what they do. Maybe they do not screen for a lack of education. There are going to be people that get jobs where, imagine if they're supposed to be running a port, where they're supposed to be keeping track of what shipments come in and the taxes and the tariffs, and they can't count or they can't do basic math. What if somebody is given a job where they are supposed to write out some government propaganda or write out some, documentation of something, and they can't write, or they don't understand the basic premise of government. They're supposed to propose a bill to Congress, but they have no idea where it goes. So you might get some people in there that are not just incompetent but woefully uneducated. You're going to get some people that steal. You're going to get some underhanded crooks that are only in it because they want to get some sort of benefit for themselves. And of course, this is all going to be ironed out later. It's going to necessitate what is known as the Pendleton Act, which is much later in the 1800s. The Pendleton Act comes in basically the 1870s, where they start saying, you know what, we're going to start doing what is known as a civil service exam, where in order to get these government positions, you have to prove that you're actually capable of doing them. You can't just get them because of government handouts. Now, does that mean that this never happens anymore? No, there's all kinds of claims of that when it comes to cabinet positions, when it comes to, jobs that are being handed out in the government, even to this day. Trump has been accused of it. Biden will definitely be accused of it. And of course, it's fair to question when people get these jobs. To give you an example, when Donald Trump took over, there were questions about Betsy DeVos getting to be the Secretary of Education because she was a proponent of the charter school movement as opposed to public schools. So there were a lot of questions as to why would you put somebody in charge of the public schools in the nation who really doesn't believe in the mission statement of that department. And again, you can argue it as it's a political argument. Biden's going to get the same stuff. Now that he's starting to name his cabinet officials, he's going to get the same questions as well. Why would you choose so-and-so for the Secretary of Transportation or the Secretary of Homeland Security or whatever else? There are going to be questions as to what are the qualifications of this person. Did they just get it because of their service to the Democratic Party? Did they just get this because they were one of the first people to say, hey, Joe Biden needs to be president of the United States? Or are they getting it because they legitimately have some sort of policy background in that area? So again, these are legitimate questions, but the spoil system still technically is there as a way of saying thank you for support. Now, Jackson's presidency gets off to a rocky start, and the reason is that the John Quincy Adams administration had passed through Congress and had signed in to law a tariff. And of course, tariffs in American history up until this point, which are taxes on exports and imports, the tariffs that have been passed in American history up until this point were only for revenue. They were only to raise money for the federal government in some capacity. So they were a tax on goods and services just to help pay for the government, whether it be the building projects in Washington, D.C., the salaries of government officials, whether it be some government programs. All of that came from things like tariffs. What's going to change in 1828 is this tariff is now going to be a protective tariff to protect some American businesses from foreign competition. And people like John C. Calhoun, pictured here, and this is probably as calm as he ever looked. John C. Calhoun was a very fiery and, shall we say, somewhat crazy individual. I mean, he was very committed to his cause. John C. Calhoun from South Carolina is going to stand up against this because he's going to make the argument that the tariff helps out northern businessmen. That, if you're a merchant and you're getting outperformed by Great Britain, in John C. Calhoun's opinion, you shouldn't get help from the government on that. The government shouldn't step in. Now, to put it in modern day terminology, what happens if, let's say, BMW puts out a really nice car and they start charging, let's say, $30,000 for it? Okay, and the American equivalent is being charged at $28,000. Well, there are going to be some people that say, you know what, the American product isn't as nice and doesn't have as many features or isn't as dependable as this German car, so I'm willing to spend $2,000 more. Well, if you put a tariff on the German cars to try and help out the American company, that is what is known as a protective tariff. So all of a sudden, that same German car jumps to being 38, 39,000. You as a consumer might say, look, I like the German car better. I like the BMW, but it's not worth $10,000 more than what the American equivalent is. Now, some people, of course, would say, hey, that's not fair. You're, not really making a fair marketplace, and you're actually hurting the American consumer by doing that, because then we don't get choice. And is that really helping in the long run? So we still have these arguments over tariffs. We still have these arguments over foreign competition. And John C. Calhoun is no different. He's going to make the argument that this is an abomination, that you shouldn't be able to do this. Okay. And of course, this it continues to where it really starts to look like the South, and for the most part, the West, against the northern businessmen. This is very much a argument where John C. Calhoun is going to be against a northern congressman and senator by the name of Daniel Webster. And this is where we come into the idea of the Great Triumvirate. The Great Triumvirate refers to three congressmen who never became president. Okay, they were cabinet officials. All of them at some point served time in the cabinet as Secretary of State. Some of them became vice president. Every one of them tried to run for the president at one point or another. None of them did. But the Great Triumvirate refers to John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster of both New Hampshire and Massachusetts. He starts off in New Hampshire and then moves to Massachusetts later. And then Henry Clay of Kentucky. Those are the Great Triumvirate. And they're the ones that are really going to push legislation through the House and the Senate throughout their entire career. They're the ones that are going to make the antebellum period very contentious, but at the same time compromised. It's their death that is actually going to trigger all kinds of problems down the line. That's a story for another day. But when I start bringing up Calhoun, Webster, and Clay, always kind of have it in your mindset that Calhoun represents the Southern interests, Webster typically represents the northern interests, and Clay usually is the compromiser, the guy in the middle. Not surprisingly, Massachusetts to the north, South Carolina to the south, Kentucky somewhat in the middle. So remembering where they're from helps you to understand kind of where they're going to be on a lot of these issues. Okay. Needless to say, the tariff is brought up again for a debate in 1832, and the tariff becomes even more stringent. It becomes even more in favor of northern businesses. So not surprisingly, John C. Calhoun basically dusts off this little known thing known as nullification, which comes into discussion with Jefferson and with Madison when they wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in regards to the Alien and Sedition Act back during the first John Adams administration. He kind of dusts it off and says, according to Jefferson and Madison, you have the right as a state to say a federal law does not hold any sort of legal status within your state, that the state gets to decide what laws they're going to enforce and what laws they're not. So not surprisingly, he makes the argument that South Carolina, because it's its own separate state and because they have agreed to be part of this union as a state, they have the right to look at a federal law, in this case, the tariff, and say, we're not following it. We're not going to enforce it. We're going to do our own thing. Now, Andrew Jackson is a Southerner. He is a Western, frontiersman. So theoretically, he should be on John C. Calhoun's side, and probably personally, he was. Probably, if you were to ask Andrew Jackson, hey, do you think that John C. Calhoun has a point? Jackson, if it's just him personally, he would say absolutely. But as president and as the representative of the entire United States, he takes great offense to the fact that somebody's going to tell the federal government that they can't do something, especially him. So, not surprisingly, Jackson's response is you either pay the tariff and you follow the law, or I'm going to come down and make you. Now, Jackson is no small threat here. He literally is saying, I'm going to get the military, I'm going to saddle up my horse, and I'm going to come down to South Carolina and arrest every dang one of you that is violating this. And he is threatening to put them to death. Now, where does he have the justification for this and the precedent? He gets it from Washington, because Washington did this during the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, while the Whiskey Rebellion ended up being calmly settled, where people did go to prison but were released in the long run, and there was no real bloodshed per se, Jackson is literally threatening to hang John C. Calhoun. Now, to make matters more complicated, Calhoun was a vice president, for crying out loud. This is a guy that's in. I mean, can you imagine? Maybe you can. Trump or Biden going out and threatening to hang their own vice president for violating the law. This is kind of where he's at mentally. He does not like the fact that anybody in the government's going to say, I'm not following the law. Henry Clay comes in and, not surprisingly, mediates it, calms things down, and says, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to reduce the tariff rates. We're still going to have tariff rates. Keep in mind, those tariffs are going to pay for something called the American system, which is Clay's bread and butter. That's his big program, building roads, dams, and bridges all throughout the United States. So Henry Clay really needs that money from the tariffs. But at the same time, he realizes, hey, we could lessen the tariff rates to at least make it to where South Carolina doesn't like paying the taxes, but it's a little bit more palatable. So the tariff of 1833 ends up being the compromise tariff. He says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to lessen the rates over time. And before long, it'll be like you're not paying anything extra. It's just a matter of kind of weaning ourselves off of that tariff. Calhoun kind of quells the uprising that's happening, and they kind of go back to business as usual. Not to be outdone, Jackson forces through what is known as the Force Bill, where he basically says in the Force Bill that the president has the right to go and enforce any law that a state does not want to follow. Now, this may not seem like such a big deal, but this is basically Jackson's shot across the bow at the South, saying you're going to follow the law whether you like it or not. Now, in the short run, it makes sense because it's basically telling Calhoun you will follow the law whether you like it or not. What the bigger picture is about 30 years later, when South Carolina says we're out of here, we're not following this president, Abraham Lincoln calls up troops and invades the South. That's the start of the Civil War. Now, where does he get the authority to do that? From the Force Bill. This mentality had already been established. So again, what seems like such a minor thing and isn't really reported widely in American history, it does have major ramifications down the line, and it's all put into place by Calhoun and Jackson back in 1833. Now, Jackson, of course, is also very controversial because he's the one that signs the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This is in the process of Western expansion, when Native Americans are being pushed out of their homelands, or they're being forced to do what is known as assimilate. They're being forced to become part of American history, or a part of American society, I should say. They're being forced to learn English. They're being forced to go to school. They're being forced to dress like other American settlers, dress like the whites, act like the whites, live amongst the whites. Some of them do manage to do that. Others kind of resist. And so there's still a tension. And the main one was with the 5 civilized tribes, which are the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole tribes. Those 5 tribes are considered the civilized tribes because all of them had developed things like written language. They had developed a social structure. They had developed, and they already kind of had those things. But if you're going to talk about assimilation, they had done the best job of it, of all the native tribes. So in the end, most states were kind of getting along with them. The one that is the outlier is Georgia. Georgia wants the land for white settlement, so they start going after the land. And when the natives sue in court, the Supreme Court actually sides with the Native Americans. Okay, John Marshall, remember good old John Marshall, he comes in and says they have a right to stay where they're at. Jackson's response, well, Marshall's made his decision, but I'm still going to go root them out. I'm going to go force them out of that land because we need it for settlement. And I have an army, and John Marshall doesn't. So he basically says, Marshall's made his decision. Let's see him enforce it. Which, is that really legal? No. But Jackson truly believes that a veto power is his way of saying something is unconstitutional. And he believes that if the Supreme Court says something is unconstitutional, but he thinks it is, he's just going to do it anyway. So Jackson is very vocal in his opposition of the other two branches of government. If Congress doesn't do something he likes, he overrules it. If the Supreme Court does something he doesn't like, he ignores it. So this is kind of where you start getting some tension throughout the government about Jackson taking executive power a little too far, because no president had up until this point. And he enforces the Indian Removal Act, where these Indians are moved west. They're moved out to Oklahoma and other locations in the west. On what is known as the Trail of Tears. And this is a poorly run program by the American military where a number of Native Americans die of exposure, they die of starvation, dehydration, disease, you name it, on the route out to these unsettled territories. And again, it's because they were so busy trying to remove them from the land, they really didn't plan ahead on how they were going to do it. And this is going to inspire a number of resistance movements by the Native Americans over the next 50 to 100 years. And this is going to become more and more of a theme as we go through our westward expansion, which we'll talk about this week. He also has the controversial bank war. Basically, what happens with this is there is a Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States. And if you remember, this was a Hamiltonian program. Hamilton had put in place, when he had his assumption of debt plan, a Bank of the United States. It had been re-upped, the charter had been renewed, and it was called the second Bank of the United States. That second Bank of the United States was still in existence, but their charter was coming up. And their charter basically was coming up in 1836, but people like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster kind of looked at this situation and said, man, it would be real nice if we could put this on the ballot in 1832 as a election year issue. Because Jackson was so against the bank, they figured if they made it an election year issue for the charter, that maybe it would hurt him at the polls. So Clay and Webster hatched this plan where they're going to re-up the bank early in Congress. Congress basically recharters the bank. They decide that, yes, we need to recertify it, but Jackson hates it. Now, why? Jackson has problems with it. Western farmers had been hurt by this because the bank had put out loans and called loans during some of the up and down times of the economy. He really didn't like the fact that the second Bank of the United States kind of played with people's livelihoods, if you will. And because of some of their decisions, some of the Western farmers had been burned. So Jackson, since those were his neighbors, didn't really like the treatment of the Western frontiersmen by the Bank of the United States, especially because of land speculation and a whole host of other problems. And he really had a problem with a guy named Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas Biddle, pictured here, was the guy in charge of the bank. Jackson didn't like the fact that Biddle was not an elected official. He was somebody that was put in charge of the bank. He was basically an employee of the bank. He was not an elected official, so he was not accountable to the government or the people in any way, shape, or form. Because of that, he felt the bank was illegal. And he looked at the Constitution and said, at no point does it say Congress has the right to form a bank or do anything that would be banking. Okay. This had already been decided, by the way, by the Supreme Court. In McCulloch v. Maryland, there had already been a Supreme Court decision on this in 1819, 13 years before this ever became a problem, where John Marshall's court had said that the bank was a legitimate thing through the Elastic Clause. They basically said since the Congress has the right to tax and the power to, control commerce, because of that, Nicholas Biddle had the right to have a bank and had the right to run it how he saw fit, because it was a stretch of the Constitution that if you can collect taxes and spend money, then theoretically you should have a bank. So Hamilton had won that, even though Hamilton was already dead. Hamilton's mentality of a bank had already been established. And Henry Clay desperately needed the bank because this is the one that collected the tariffs and specifically spent the money to build his roads, dams, and bridges in his American system. Now, of course, when the bank war rears its ugly head, Jackson ends up victorious because he vetoes the bank and the bank's charter basically fails. So the bank is now on borrowed time. It's going to close. So sure enough, it becomes an election year issue and it backfires. Henry Clay runs against Andrew Jackson. And you can see by the graphic there that Jackson runs as a Democrat and Henry Clay runs as a national Republican. And Jackson trounces him. So Clay is completely outmaneuvered here. Not only does he not get his bank, he loses the election in a landslide. Okay. And of course, all of this happens in the election of 1832, where Henry Clay is just overwhelmed. So Clay, again, loses a presidential bid. And in this case, again, to Andrew Jackson, even though in 1824, John Quincy Adams ends up winning, Clay is trounced again in his attempt to become president of the United States. And again, I'm not going to get into too many of the details. It's not that important to it. But Jackson wins. And since he wins in a much bigger election landslide in 1832, he takes that as, hey, everything I've done up until this point, think about what he's done. He's removed Native Americans against the Supreme Court's urgings. He's canceled out a bank that the Supreme Court said was okay. He's gone against John C. Calhoun and he's challenged him, basically threatened to kill him. And the American people still went, yep, that's the guy we want. So again, Jackson is riding high, very high as a candidate. And this is where people really start to point as, is he King Andrew the First? Is he somebody that has gone a little too far? Because he didn't just, recharter the bank, or he didn't just deny the charter of the bank. He starts to go after the bank and say, you've got to start putting your money into state-run banks before we shut you down. So he moves to actually kill it before it ever dies. So he hates it that much. He wants them to close their doors as soon as possible. You're not going to be rechartered, so you might as well just get rid of it. Now, the results are going to be very, very detrimental to the United States. We're going to have some economic hard times on the horizon, but Jackson's not going to be present when that happens. His successor is going to have to deal with that. So Jackson kind of rides high on his power, but it's a very short-sighted way of looking at power. Okay. Now, because of all these very contentious things, and because of the fear that the American people were backing Jackson, they made the argument that they backed Jackson because the Democrats were more organized. The National Republicans go away. The small third parties go away. You saw on the previous slide the anti-Masons. I'm not going to get into them. They're in your book if you want to look them up. But bottom line is all these little splinter parties start forming up into what is known as the Whig Party. Now, the role of Jackson is the Whigs are the anti-Jackson party. Basically, anybody that doesn't like Jackson or has been sold out by Jackson is going to become a Whig. And this is just over time, these guys are going to slowly kind of trickle into the Whig ranks. Now, the Whig Party, again, formed specifically to go against Jackson, but in reality, they go against Jacksonian policies. This is the party that's going to embrace the American system of Henry Clay. This is the party that's going to embrace the idea of a national bank, or at least something similar to that. The Whigs are going to embrace state rights. They're going to embrace the idea of a more limited executive in the White House. That anything Jackson does, they're going to be kind of on the opposite side of it. So the platform, weirdly enough, is still written by Andrew Jackson, because Jackson will say, here's the Democratic vision, and the Whigs will say, well, we're the exact opposite. So this is kind of the birth. Again, if somebody asks you, when did the modern political parties start? It's kind of in the 1830s with the birth of the Whigs, because it's basically the Democrats are over here and the Whigs take the exact opposite mentality. In the election of 1836, after Jackson serves out his second term, somewhat uneventfully comparative to his first term, his vice president, Martin Van Buren, who's from New York, he's known as kind of the mover and shaker of the Democratic Party. They call themselves the Jacksonian Democrats, but in reality, it's Van Buren. Van Buren is going to run, and he's widely considered to be a slam dunk. Jackson is still very popular. Van Buren was kind of riding his coattails. So there's a good chance he's going to ride to election and no problem in a landslide in 1836. The Whigs kind of stumble out of the gate, and their strategy is to run a bunch of what are known as dark horse candidates. These are people that are regional, where they say, all right, William Henry Harrison is popular out west, so we'll run him in the western states. Henry Clay is popular in the mid, America, in the middle states, if you will, we'll run him there. Daniel Webster is popular up in New England, we'll run him up there. And John C. Calhoun is popular down in the South, we'll run him there. And the idea is we're going to run as many candidates as we possibly can to where nobody can get a plurality in the Electoral College. And as you remember from 1824, if nobody can get enough votes in the Electoral College, then it goes to the House of Representatives, and then the House of Representatives decides who the president's going to be. Their argument is if they can just get it to the House of Representatives, they can convince at least the House to back up one of their candidates to beat out Van Buren. Now, what are the results? It's not even close. Van Buren trounces the four candidates and he walks to election. Now, that's not exactly a good thing for him because Van Buren, his main characteristic is that he is not Jackson, whereas Jackson is a hardcore, heroic figure that's going to do his own thing and hard-headed. Van Buren is more of a politician. He's very calm. He's very deliberative about, working with people and trying to, find common ground. Well, the Whigs are so wound up with hatred towards Jackson that Van Buren basically walks right into their buzzsaw. They're going to do whatever they can to kind of take him out. And it's sad because Van Buren isn't necessarily a bad guy. He's somebody that really kind of gets derailed by Jackson. Even though he is a very devoted Jacksonian, he is not Andrew Jackson. And this is what I've said all along. You never want to be the guy that follows greatness. You don't want to be the guy that takes over for Michael Jordan. You don't want to be the guy that has to go on stage to follow Michael Jackson. You want to be kind of your own person. Van Buren was always in Jackson's shadow. So not surprisingly, when he takes over, there's all kinds of problems. He's got international problems where Canada is starting to rebel against Great Britain. And people say, hey, we got to come to Canada's defense. We got to help them out because they're trying to get rid of a colonial power, just like we did. And Van Buren really doesn't do all that much. When Mexico rises up against Spain, we really don't back them up either. And there are questions about, what are we doing? Why aren't we helping out these people that are trying to get a democratic government? Why aren't we helping these people out? Van Buren really doesn't have a response because in reality, Van Buren just doesn't feel like it's our place. So it's running contrary to the Monroe Doctrine, one, and number two, it's making us look very weak. So Van Buren, by just not doing anything, has issues. There are also problems during his presidency on the issue of slavery. We had ended the international slave trade, and yet there's a situation that happens during his presidency that brings up whether or not slavery should be in this country, and it actually inspires the modern day abolitionist movement. It's a slave ship called the Amistad. It basically is a slaver ship that was on its way to basically the West Indies. The slaves on board basically took over the ship and they forced the Spanish captains to steer them back home. Now, these Spanish captains kind of double-crossed them and they ended up in American waters and were captured. Believe it or not, they were captured by the British but escorted into the United States. And now the United States has to figure out what to do with these slaves. And since the slaves were imported into the United States, it brings up, should they be slaves here? Are they still going to be slaves? Do they need to be sent back? Whose property are they? Are they the Spanish because it was a Spanish ship? Are they the British because the British basically, claimed it? Are they American slaves now? Should they be kept here? Should they be sent back to Africa? Long story short, Van Buren is asked all kinds of questions about this, and he basically just says, well, I'll let the courts figure it out. He passes the buck entirely. He wants no part of this. So when Spain, Great Britain, everybody else is screaming and yelling about this, he takes no position. So again, he just looks very weak comparative. And, there are arguments as to whether or not he is weak, but comparative to Jackson, he certainly does look weak. And of course, they have an economic depression because of the panic. And what is it? The Panic of 1837. The causes of this depression, this economic depression, all stem from the banking crisis. Because the second bank in the United States closes, they have to kick out all the accounts to state-run banks, and the state-run banks all run the economy their own directions. There's no real centralized authority. There's no real centralized government agency that's running the economy. So, of course, it causes all kinds of issues. Some banks run better than others. Some loan better than others. Some have better rates. It's all over the place. So the monetary system is complete chaos. It doesn't help that we fall in economic bad times. It doesn't help that there's all kinds of problems throughout the globe going on right now that affects trade. All of that plays in to where Van Buren really has a rough time as president of the United States. And the results of the Depression is Van Buren becomes one of the most despised presidents while he's in office. Because, again, he just doesn't look like he's handling things. And his attempts to stop the Depression are very much suspect to the Democrats because his idea is, well, we should have what is known as an independent treasury. Well, when he starts to describe it, he starts saying, well, we should have a centralized authority that can loan money to the government, that collects taxes, that spends money, whatever else. And what does the independent treasury sound like? It sounds like the third bank of the United States. So here you have a Democratic president who's going against the previous Democratic president, and his fight to get rid of the bank by basically instituting a bank by a different name. It's the same program, you just call it something different. So Van Buren again is just kind of a lovable loser when it comes to this. The poor guy can never seem to get it straight. And so, sure enough, he has other issues. Texas decides to declare independence from Mexico during this time period. The Spanish had visions of what to do with this territory. They never got around to it because the Mexican government basically overthrew the Spanish authority and became their own separate country. Well, in the early stages of that Mexican Republic, not surprisingly, Texans decided, you know what, we are our own independent republic as well. So that causes friction not just between Mexico and Texas, but also Mexico and the United States, because while Texas has Americans living there, settlers, people that had gone down to become cattle ranchers and, farmers or whatever else, they were considered Texans. When Texas basically declares their independence, a bunch of Americans also stream down into Texas to help them fight for it. And these are not just like country bumpkins that have nothing better to do. These are people that are sitting congressmen like Davy Crockett, famous frontiersmen like Jim Bowie. Like, all these people start going down into Texas to try and help them fight for their independence. And so the Texas Rebellion turns into basically a war of independence for Texas to become their own republic. Now, they declare their independence from Mexico. Mexico invades, and it doesn't go well for the Texans at the very beginning. The Texans are surrounded at a place called the Alamo in what is today San Antonio, and basically 200 Texans hold out against the entire Mexican army. It was about 6,000 soldiers for a few days, but then they're basically run over and everybody there is slaughtered, which inspires the Remember the Alamo as the battle cry of Texas. It's even worse at a place called Goliad, where the entire force of Texans is surrounded by Santa Anna's army and totally annihilated as well. It's an even bigger death toll than at the Alamo. But because Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett had died at the Alamo, and they were kind of celebrity status, the Alamo gets more play. Either way, it's not going well. Mexico ends up surrendering, though, because Santa Anna gets outmaneuvered by a guy named Sam Houston. Sam Houston had raised a pretty sizable army of Texans and Americans, and basically had won a battle at a place called San Jacinto. When they win that battle, Santa Anna is forced to basically sign a treaty because he's captured. He signs a treaty that basically allows for Texas to become their own republic. Now, they don't become part of the United States yet. The United States can't really do that because we have been claiming the entire time through Van Buren that we had not had anything to do with this, that we didn't help the Texans, that we weren't involved, even though we totally were. So we can't exactly annex or add on Texas to the United States. So for about a little more than a decade, Texas becomes its own republic. So that's why, I don't know if you've ever heard of Six Flags, the theme park. That started in Texas because Texas has been under Six Flags. Okay, they were a Spanish republic, a Mexican republic, an English republic at one point. They were their own republic as well. They were part of the United States, and there's one more that I'm totally blanking on. I think France was the other flag, but they've been under Six Flags. That's where, so the Six Flag Republic is referring to Texas because they've flown the flag of 6 different nations, including their own. Okay, so that's kind of where you get this mentality that Texas is different than everybody else. In the end, Texas declares their independence, becomes their own republic, declares neutrality against all combatants. The United States had also declared that. And again, it's this idea that do we add them on? And this becomes a debate from Van Buren all the way up to and through Tyler and Polk later on. In the end, Van Buren only serves one term because in the election of 1840, the Whigs finally get their stuff together and they run just one candidate. So Van Buren runs against a war hero in his own right, William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison was born in Virginia. He ran as from the territory of Indiana, now state of Indiana, as he had been the governor there of the territory and then state. So now Harrison is running for the presidency. He's again another kind of Jacksonian frontiersman type mentality. The American people respond to it, and Harrison wins against Van Buren pretty handily. And the campaign was very much what is known as a grassroots campaign, where Harrison really didn't campaign as much as people kind of campaigned for him. And of course, it has the very catchy slogan, Tippy Canoe and Tyler too, because it's reminding people that William Henry Harrison was a war hero. He had won the Battle of Tippecanoe amongst other big contests, if you will, against Tecumseh and against the British during the War of 1812. So they kind of appeal to that. The result, of course, is Harrison wins the election, becomes president of the United States, and only serves 31 days. William Henry Harrison has the unfortunate distinction as being the shortest serving American president, only serving 31 days of his presidency because he dies of pneumonia after not wearing a hat and gloves at his own inauguration, speaking in the cold and the sleet for 2 hours, and then getting a cold that slowly develops into pneumonia and kills him, which allows for his vice president, John Tyler, to become president of the United States. But that's a story for a different day when we talk about Manifest Destiny in Mexico, specifically the Mexican War. All right, folks, that's it for right now. Sorry that I'm long-winded as usual. The other ones this week will be a little bit shorter. So if you have any questions, if you need anything elaborated on, please reach out and ask questions. Again, you have 3 more videos coming this week. One on the Mexican War and Manifest Destiny, which will be tomorrow, which will be Wednesday. Thursday, you will get a video on the antebellum and reformers. And then Friday, you will get a video on sectionalization leading up to Lincoln getting the presidency. Have a good one, folks.